Sydney walked alone, the flowers still clutched in her hands, the sweet scent of the petals mingling with the river's damp cold. In the village, the men looked at her as if she were too beautiful to be taken seriously, and too stubborn to deserve care. Everyone there knew her as the forgotten Omega, the rude florist. She spent her days selling bundles along the road, and her evenings pretending the stares and cruel words didn't hurt. The worst of them was Gideon Ashford, with his elegant gifts, his soft words, and that smile that always seemed to belong to a man who already believed he owned what he wanted. Sydney had never given him hope. That was exactly why he made a point of humiliating her whenever he could. She stopped at the water's edge, her fingers red from gripping the stems so tightly, and tried to breathe. There were days when loneliness felt as heavy as an entire body. There were nights when she wondered whether there was, somewhere in the world, a life where she would not have to defend herself all the time. A life where her opinions would not be treated like an insult. A life where being beautiful did not feel like a sentence. Then she heard the crash above. Sydney looked up at once and saw the Alpha King's white mare plunging down the slope, her heavy body unable to fight the fall. She recognized the animal immediately. Everyone in the region knew Daisy, and the king treated her like something rare, precious, almost like part of his very soul. Even more now, pregnant, with that round belly carrying a life that seemed to belong to destiny itself. Without thinking, Sydney ran. Because sometimes the most broken part of a person is also the first to move when it sees another creature about to be lost. And at the top of the hill, the Alpha King had already seen everything, including the only woman who could change the course of that night before the world even understood what was happening. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. There were places that were more than places. For King Callan Vale, that hill was memory, refuge, and wound all at once. Every time he rode up there, with the cold wind striking his face and the world opening below in wide bands of green and silver, he felt the same tightness rise in his chest. An old ache, the kind that never truly fades because it was carved too early in life. He still remembered his mother, not in clear images, because childhood had a cruel way of erasing the gentlest details. But he remembered the sound of her voice, the way she would point toward the horizon and say the sky looked wider from there. He remembered how she used to laugh softly when he insisted on climbing higher, as if that stretch of earth had been made for just the two of them. After she was gone, the hill remained the only place where the air did not feel too heavy to breathe, and that was why Callan kept bringing Daisy there. The mare was white, strong, elegant, with dark, watchful eyes and a presence that seemed to calm everything around her. He treated her like she had a soul, because to him, in a way, she did. Daisy was not just his companion. She was comfort, loyalty, and one of the last living threads connecting him to that place above the valley where grief and love had first taken root. Now, she was pregnant. And Callan, who knew every shift in her body, every slower step, every careful breath, felt a deeper tenderness every time he looked at her. The life growing inside her made everything feel sacred, as if this ride, repeated so many times between them, now carried a new kind of meaning. As if fate itself had become more delicate. The wind moved softly as he guided her along the ridge. The view was breathtaking in a way that almost hurt. Down below, the river cut through the land in a dark, winding line, cold and bright at once. The morning light flashed across the water in small, dangerous glimmers. Callan watched the edge of the cliff the way he always did, too alert to ever truly relax, and rested a hand against the mare's neck in a quiet gesture of affection. "Easy, girl," he murmured. Daisy answered with a low sound, almost a sigh. And then everything happened too fast. One misstep, a shift in the ground too small to notice before the danger had already come. The mare startled at something he never even saw, perhaps the crack of a branch, perhaps a sudden movement in the wind, and her body slipped toward the edge. Callan felt his heart drop before he even saw her fall. Daisy! The name tore out of him, raw and useless against gravity. The mare fought for balance, but the earth gave way beneath her hooves. 1 second she was beside him, the next she was gone, sliding down the slope in a desperate rush that ended in open space. Callan ran to the edge, blood turning cold in his veins, and watched the white body tumble over rock and dirt before being dragged toward the frozen river below. For one terrible moment, everything went still. The king stood frozen, staring as if the world had just taken something from him that could never be replaced. It was not only fear, it was panic with a name attached to it. It was the memory of his mother, of this hill, of the afternoons when he and Daisy used to walk there as if they were the last two living things in a world too large to hold them. It was the awful feeling that this fall was carrying away not just the mare, but the last place he could still call home. And just below, by the riverbank, a woman lifted her head. Sydney was sitting on a wet stone, a bundle of flowers she had picked to sell still clutched in her hands. The cold wind tangled in her hair and tugged at the hem of her worn dress around her legs. She was not there by chance. She was there because she had needed to walk to keep herself from breaking, because the memories of the village still burned. She knew what it meant to be looked at as if she were less. She knew the sound of laughter when she passed. She knew what it was to have men come close with crooked smiles, thinking a beautiful woman alone was something they could simply take with their hands. And every time she pushed them away with a firm voice and an unbending back, the humiliation followed. The whispers, the insults, the voices saying she was too proud, too cold, too difficult, as if refusing to be owned was some kind of flaw. That day, she had already endured it again. She had sat beside the river trying to breathe, trying to forget Gideon Ashford, the same man who bought her flowers so often, and looked at her like his desire should have been enough to make her yield. Even now, remembering the way he smiled last time, as though a refusal was only a door not yet opened, sent a shiver through her skin. She tightened her fingers around the flowers. Their sweetness could not mask the bitterness of humiliation. Then she heard it. A muffled crash, a violent shift from the ridge above, followed by the horrifying sound of a heavy body sliding over stone and earth. Sydney looked up just in time to see the white mare being dragged toward the river, her swollen belly heavy with life, her beauty endangered by the merciless cold of the current. Everything inside her moved before thought could catch up. She surged to her feet. There was no hesitation, no time for fear. Only the sight in front of her and the sudden certainty that, if she did nothing, that animal would die in front of her eyes. Sydney dropped the flowers without even noticing, as if the world had reduced itself to one single urgent task. The water below looked black and alive, its current brutal and unwilling to bargain with anyone. She ran, and as she ran, the river seemed to grow. The wind seemed to cut deeper, and the humiliation still burning in her chest turned into something else entirely. Motion, courage, and resolve. Sydney had no idea yet that, high above her on the hill, the king had seen everything, nor that in just a few seconds both of their lives would change forever. Sydney woke to warmth at her side and, for one disorienting second, thought she had somehow died and landed in a very expensive afterlife. Then she opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was carved wood, dark and polished, with soft light flickering along the beams. The room smelled faintly of cedar, herbs, and clean linen. It was definitely not the riverbank. She blinked. Then she noticed the blanket. It was thick, soft, and probably worth more than everything she had ever owned. Sydney stared at it with deep suspicion, the kind only a poor woman could master. She shifted and discovered her wet clothes had been replaced with dry linen. Her hair had been loosely braided, and someone had even warmed her feet. That made her frown. Either I'm dead, she muttered, voice rough from the cold, or I've offended a very rich ghost. A voice answered from the doorway. For the record, you're alive. Sydney turned. King Callan Vale stood there in dark trousers and a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking tired, dangerous, and unfairly attractive. He looked like a man who had not slept and did not intend to admit it. Sydney narrowed her eyes. You again. His mouth twitched. Me again. How did I get here? You fainted. I did not faint. Callan lifted one brow. You slid down a frozen riverbank, got rescued, and then looked at me like I was responsible for the weather. I'm calling that a faint. Sydney shut her mouth. Unfortunately, he had a point. She sat up slowly. I was not looking at you like that. No? He stepped inside, amused. Then what was it? Exhaustion, cold, mild distrust. That one's fair. And you, she said, pointing at him, have the face of a man who is used to giving orders. Callan looked oddly pleased. I do have that face. She blinked. You should not say things like that out loud. Why not? Because it makes you sound worse. That got a real smile from him. Not polished, not practiced, just real. Sydney looked away first, which was a mistake, because her eyes landed on the tray beside the bed. Tea, bread, berries, all of it absurdly perfect. She stared at it, then at him. Is this for me? Yes. Why? Because you nearly froze to death saving my mare. You're pregnant, Mare. He nodded. My pregnant mare. Sydney frowned. That feels like the kind of detail you should have led with. The fact that she's pregnant is not usually the first thing I mention when someone rescues her. You should reconsider that. Context matters. Another smile, quicker this time. He moved closer, and the room seemed to adjust around him. Not heavier, just more focused. That was irritating in a way Sydney did not appreciate. How long was I out? She asked. Not long. That means one of two things in royal language, she said. Either it was truly not long or everyone panicked and nobody wants to say so. His expression answered before his words did. Long enough for me to worry. That made the room go quiet. Sydney had no clever reply, so she reached for the tea. The warmth spread into her hands immediately. One sip tasted like honey, cinnamon, and comfort she had no business receiving from a king. When she looked up again, Callan was still watching her. Not like a man waiting for something, like a man trying to understand her. That was worse. A soft knock came at the door. Callan turned. Come in. The door opened, and Gideon Ashford stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers tied with a black ribbon. Sydney went still. Of course it was him. He wore expensive clothes and a smile polished enough to look charming from a distance and infuriating up close. His eyes moved from Sydney to Callan and back again. Your Majesty, he said smoothly. I was told the woman from the river was brought inside. I was told, Callan said, just as smoothly, that you were not needed. Sydney almost smiled. Gideon ignored the hint and stepped farther in. I only wanted to make sure she was safe. That's generous, Sydney said dryly. Since I don't remember asking. His gaze sharpened. You always had a sharp tongue. And you always had terrible timing, she said, right when I'm trying to recover from drowning. Callan made a sound that was either a cough or a laugh. Gideon looked at him. I've known Sydney a long time. No, Sydney said. You've known how to buy flowers. The room went still. Callan turned to her like he had just discovered something he liked very much. Sydney suddenly wished her face was less warm. Gideon smiled, but it had turned thin. I've admired your restraint, he said, voice polite enough to pass in a crowd and ugly enough to ruin one. It would be a shame if gratitude toward the king made you forget who's actually stood by you. Sydney laughed once, not because it was funny, because otherwise she might have said something worse. Stood by me? She said. Gideon, the only thing you've ever stood by is a mirror. Callan's expression changed, not toward her, for her. That did something unpleasant and dangerous to her chest. Gideon's jaw tightened. I didn't come here to argue. Then you came to the wrong room, Sydney said. Callan exhaled once, slow and controlled. Mr. Ashford, unless you have a reason to be here, I suggest you leave her to rest. Gideon held Sydney's gaze a second too long enough for her to remember all the flowers he had bought from her stall, every soft voice, every self-assured smile, every moment that had felt wrong before she had words for it. It had never been affection. It had always been possession dressed nicely. Now she could name it. Gideon finally bowed, though it looked more like an insult in formal clothing. Of course, Your Majesty. He placed the bouquet on the table beside the bed. Sydney stared at it. Then at him. Take those with you, she said. His expression didn't move. I don't want them. For one perfect second, the room shifted. Then Gideon smiled, thin and cold. As you wish. He left. The door shut. Silence. Callan looked at the flowers, then back at her. That was impressive. Sydney shrugged. I was raised poor, not foolish. He laughed, short and real. She reached for the bread and bit into it like it had offended her personally. Hunger hit all at once. Callan watched her eat with a look so soft it made her self-conscious. What? She asked. You're calmer than I expected. Sydney swallowed. I was freezing. Now I'm fed. I'm basically a new woman. A very honest one. Exactly. He leaned against the wall, watching her. You always talk to kings like this? Only the handsome ones. His gaze held hers a second too long. Then he said quietly, Good. I'd hate to disappoint you. Sydney's heartbeat tripped. She looked away before he could see it. Outside, the castle moved on. Somewhere below, the pregnant mare rested safe and warm. And somewhere in the space between a rescued woman and a lonely king, something impossible had already started to grow. Sydney had just started to believe the castle might survive her presence when everything got complicated again. It happened at breakfast. Or at what Callan insisted on calling breakfast, which seemed to involve too much food, too many servants trying not to stare, and a long table polished to the point of intimidation. Sydney sat in a chair that was probably older than her bloodline and tried very hard not to look like a woman who had once eaten toast standing up behind a flower cart. Across from her, Callan was pretending to read a report while clearly watching her over the top of it. You know, Sydney said, cutting into a soft-boiled egg with unnecessary focus. If you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to start charging admission. His eyes lifted. For what? For staring. Callan set the paper down. You'd make a terrible businesswoman. I sold flowers to men who thought a smile was a contract. I think I'd be fine. That got the tiniest pause from him. Not a big one, just enough for her to notice it. Good. She liked making him pause. It was a dangerous kind of fun, the sort that made a woman forget she was supposed to be careful around kings. But Callan made it easy to forget. Around him, the castle felt less like a fortress and more like a place that had been waiting for sound, waiting for laughter, waiting for someone to arrive who didn't bow to the silence. And that, Sydney suspected, was why he looked at her the way he did. Not because she was delicate, not because she was convenient, because she was loud in the exact places his life had gone quiet. A memory flickered at the edge of her mind then. The hill, the mare, the panic in his face when Daisy had slipped. She had seen grief in him that day, but not the kind that made a man soft, the kind that made him careful with everything he loved. Maybe that was why his attention felt so intense. He didn't look at people casually. He looked at them like they mattered. That thought made her chest feel strange, so she reached for more coffee. A servant entered with a silver pitcher, then froze when he saw Callan leaning back in his chair, with one ankle crossed over the other, entirely too relaxed for a king. The poor man almost bowed too early. Sydney watched it happen and had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Callan noticed. Of course he did. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. That face says otherwise. This face says I've just realized your entire staff is afraid of you." "They're not afraid of me?" Sydney looked at him. "Callan." He sighed like a man caught in a lie. "A little afraid." She smiled into her cup. "Good. That makes the flirting more interesting." He choked on absolutely nothing. Sydney nearly lost it. It was the first time she had seen a king look even mildly surprised by being teased, and she decided right then that she might enjoy herself far too much in this castle. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Callan looked up, and the expression on his face changed in a way that made her pause. Not because it was dramatic, because it was relieved, like the sound of her laughter had gone straight through something in him. For one moment, neither of them said anything. Then he leaned forward slightly. "I was hoping you'd do that again." Sydney blinked. "What? Laugh?" "Yes." She studied him for a second, suspicious now. "Why?" He gave her a look that was almost too honest. "Because you make the room feel less empty." That landed harder than she expected. Sydney looked down at her plate before her face could betray her. She had spent too long being the kind of woman people looked through. Hearing a man like Callan say that she made a room feel full was, well, dangerous and strangely wonderful. Before she could answer, the doors at the far end of the hall opened. The atmosphere changed immediately. Sydney felt it before she saw him. Gideon Ashford entered like a man who believed every room should rearrange itself to make space for his ego. He wore a dark coat with a subtle sheen, a ring that caught the light too often, and the kind of expression that always made Sydney think of a locked drawer full of bad decisions. He smiled when he saw her. Sydney did not smile back. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing to Callan with polished ease. "I was told the woman from the river was doing better." "She is," Callan said. Gideon's gaze moved to Sydney. "Glad to hear it." "Don't sound so shocked," she said. "I do heal." A servant nearby made the tiniest sound that might have been a laugh and then immediately regretted it. Gideon ignored the jab. "I had hoped to speak with you, Sydney." "That's a pity," she said. "I was hoping for a quiet breakfast." Callan's mouth twitched. Gideon noticed. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes sharpened. "I brought something for you." He lifted a small parcel wrapped in linen and set it on the edge of the table. Sydney stared at it as if it might be cursed. "Flowers?" she asked. "Among other things." "Wonderful. You've upgraded from predictable to mysterious." Callan leaned back. "That wasn't a compliment." "I know." Gideon untied the linen himself. Inside were dried petals, a ribbon, and a small vial of amber liquid. Sydney's instincts immediately turned cold. "Why are you showing me that?" "Because," Gideon said softly, "you should know someone has been asking after you." "Who?" He looked at her for 1 second too long, then smiled. "Oh, I think you'll meet her soon enough?" Callan's entire posture changed. Not dramatically. Worse, subtly. The kind of subtle shift that meant he had gone from relaxed to alert in a single breath. Sydney noticed immediately. She hated that she noticed. "Is this supposed to scare me?" she asked Gideon. He tilted his head. "Should it?" "No," she said. "It should bore me. But you've never had enough charm for intimidation." That time the servant really did laugh. He tried to hide it by coughing into his sleeve. Callan looked at Sydney like she had just become his favorite person in the room, which was absolutely not helping her focus. Gideon's smile didn't falter, but it grew colder around the edges. "I came in good faith." "No," Sydney said. "You came in expensive shoes." Callan let out a quiet breath that was definitely amusement. Gideon's jaw tightened. "You used to understand when someone was trying to help you." Sydney set down her fork. The humor in her face vanished, not into anger, but into something cleaner and sharper. "No," she said evenly. "You used to mistake silence for gratitude." The air went still. Callan looked from her to Gideon and back again, and for the first time, Sydney saw that he already understood more than he was saying. He had not missed the way Gideon spoke to her, or the way Sydney stiffened when he entered. The king was watching, learning, and not interfering unless she needed him to. That alone made her trust him more than she wanted to admit. Gideon glanced at the table, then back at her. "I only wanted to remind you that not everyone in this castle is interested in using you." Sydney's brows lifted. That sounded suspiciously like an accusation. It was a warning. Callan stood. The motion was calm, but it changed the room. Servants went still. Even the air seemed to straighten. "Mr. Ashford," he said, voice mild enough to be dangerous. "If you have a warning, say it plainly. If not, leave." Gideon looked at him for a long moment, then smiled again, though this one had no warmth in it at all. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He reached for the linen parcel again, as if to take it back, then paused. His eyes landed on Sydney. "The woman who asked after you," he said quietly, "knows where you used to sell flowers." Sydney's stomach tightened, not because she feared the answer, because she already knew what it meant. Someone from her old life had found her. And whoever it was, Gideon wanted her to know that he knew before she did. When Gideon finally left, the hall remained too quiet. Callan sat back down, but he no longer looked relaxed. Sydney reached for her coffee. Her fingers were steadier than she felt. "She's from my village," Sydney said. Callan's gaze stayed on her. "You know that?" "No." She stared into the cup. "But I know that look." "The look being?" "The one men get when they enjoy being the messenger more than the message." Callan's mouth tightened, almost a smile, almost not. "That's very specific." "You'd be amazed what you learn working around bad people." The words came out sharper than she meant, and the silence that followed was different this time. Not awkward, just real. Callan leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. "Sydney." She looked up. He wasn't wearing the king's face now, not fully. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and careful in a way that had everything to do with caring too much. "If someone from your past is here," he said quietly, "you don't have to deal with it alone." Sydney's throat tightened for half a second. Then she scoffed, because she had never trusted a moment that got too tender too fast. "You say that like you've met me." "I have." "No, Your Majesty," she said, and finally gave him a small, sharp smile. "You've met my attitude. That's not the same thing." His laugh came low and quick, and there it was again, that look in his face, like she had pulled something living back into him. Sydney saw it clearly now. The castle had been quieter before she arrived. Not safer. Quieter. The kind of quiet that settles in places where grief has had too much room. She did not say the thought out loud, but she believed it. She believed she had not stumbled into Callan Vale's life by accident. She had arrived in it exactly when he needed someone who would argue with him, tease him, call him out, and laugh in the same breath. Someone who would remind him that the world could still be warm. Outside the windows, the northern sky had gone pale with morning. Somewhere deeper in the castle, Daisy the Mare was still resting, still pregnant, still alive. And in the silence left behind by Gideon's visit, Sydney understood something she did not like at all. The danger in this castle was not only that someone wanted her, it was that the king was beginning to want her too. And unlike the men from her past, Callan Vale looked as if he would move heaven itself to make sure she was never used again. By the time Sydney reached the east corridor, she already knew she was being watched. Callan was waiting by a tall window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a report he clearly wasn't reading. The golden light around him softened his face just enough to make him look almost dangerously attractive. "Someone's in a mood," he said. Sydney kept walking. "Someone's in a castle." "Fair." She stopped in front of him, arms crossed. "If you say good morning, I'm leaving." "I wasn't going to." "Good. I was going to say you look dangerous before coffee." That made her pause. Callan smiled, pleased with himself. "You're getting too comfortable," she said. "With you?" he asked. "I'm doomed." She should not have smiled. She did anyway. The castle had changed since she arrived. Not in grand ways, in small ones. There was laughter in the halls now. Servants smiled more. Callan spoke to people by name. He asked for tea and forgot to drink it. And when he listened to Sydney, it felt like her words mattered. That part was the most dangerous. "You're staring again," Callan said. "I'm thinking." "About me?" "You're not that interesting." He pressed a hand to his chest. "That's brutal." "It's honest." He was about to answer when a bell rang at the end of the corridor. A servant came hurrying up. "Your Majesty, a message at the western gate." Callan took the note, read it once, and his whole expression changed. Sydney saw it in his face immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the paper. Only one line was written there. "The woman from the village has arrived. She remembers you." Sydney's fingers tightened. Callan studied her. "Who is she?" Sydney folded the note once. "Tessa." His eyes sharpened. "Who's Tessa?" "Someone from my village. Someone who talks too much." "That doesn't sound good." "It isn't." Callan waited. Sydney hated how patiently he waited. "She knows people," Sydney said. "The kind of woman who smiles in public and sells secrets in private." Callan's jaw tightened. "Gideon brought her here to get to you." "Yes." He started to move. Sydney caught his arm. "Don't go after him yet." "Why not?" "Because that's exactly what he wants." Callan looked at her hand on his sleeve, then back at her face. "You're giving strategy now?" "I'm always giving strategy." "That is the most attractive thing anyone has ever said to me." Sydney stared at him, then snorted. He looked far too pleased with himself. Before she could reply, another servant appeared. "Your Majesty, the Mare is restless." Sydney turned. "Daisy?" "She's pacing," the servant said, "and refusing her hay." Callan's expression softened. "She does that before storms." Sydney frowned. "Then maybe she knows something." "You say that like it's normal." "It's a pregnant horse in a castle full of secrets. Normal is cancelled." That got a laugh out of the servant, who immediately looked embarrassed. Callan glanced at Sydney like she had just become his favorite problem. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't an order. She followed. Daisy's stall was warm and bright when they entered. The mare lifted her head at once, ears forward, belly heavy and round with the life she carried. Sydney softened instantly and stroked her neck. "Hey, girl." Daisy snorted and pressed her muzzle to Sydney's shoulder, restless and uneasy. "She's worried," Callan said. "You just noticed?" "I was hoping it was my imagination." "Bad luck." He looked at her. "You always talk to kings like this?" "Only the annoying ones." That earned her a real smile. Then the room changed. Gideon stood in the doorway, immaculate as always, with Tessa behind him, stiff and uneasy. Sydney felt the old anger flare immediately. Of course he had brought her. "Your Majesty," Gideon said smoothly, bowing. I heard the mare was agitated. You heard wrong, Callan said. Gideon's smile didn't move. I know how much she matters to you. That's not the same thing. Gideon's gaze slid to Sydney. No, it isn't. Tessa looked at Sydney, then away. Sydney knew that expression. Fear, caution, regret. Hello, Tessa, she said. Tessa flinched. Sydney. Gideon folded his hands. Tessa came with useful information. Sydney gave him a flat look. That is never a good sign. He ignored her. A woman from your village asked about you. Sydney went still. Tessa swallowed. She said you should be careful who you trust in the castle. Silence. Callan's gaze dropped to Gideon. Gideon looked back without blinking, wearing that same controlled smile Sydney had learned to hate. He wanted them unsettled. He wanted them divided. Callan's voice turned cold. Leave. Gideon lifted a hand. Your Majesty, now. Tessa took a quick step back, clearly relieved to go. Gideon lingered just long enough to make it worse, then looked at Sydney. If she remembers the past, he said quietly, she may not stay here long. Sydney's blood chilled. Callan stepped forward. Sydney touched his arm, harder this time. Not because she was afraid, because she understood the trap. Gideon wanted anger. He wanted mistakes. So Sydney looked at him and smiled, sweet as a blade. Then it's a good thing, she said, that I'm harder to scare than you are. For the first time, Gideon's expression slipped. Just enough. Then he bowed and left. The stall went quiet, except for Daisy's restless breathing. Callan turned to Sydney. What happened years ago? Sydney looked at him for a beat. I'll tell you. Tonight. He studied her face, then nodded once. Tonight. She rolled her eyes, but her pulse betrayed her. As they left the stall, Daisy pressed her muzzle softly against Sydney's shoulder, and Sydney smiled before she could stop herself. Callan saw it, and smiled too. Gideon had come to stir up old wounds. Instead, he had only made the bond between them stronger. Sydney barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. Gideon's smile, Tessa's guilty face, Callan's expression when he realized this was not random, not harmless, not small. By dawn, she had given up pretending she was resting and sat up in bed with the blankets twisted around her legs like a trap. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Then came a soft knock. Sydney frowned. If that's another nobleman with flowers, I'm throwing a shoe. The door opened. Callan stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking far too awake for the hour. He wore dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and Sydney immediately resented how good he looked before sunrise. He held 1 cup out to her. Good morning. She stared at him. You said good morning, she accused. I said it quietly. That still counts. He smiled and crossed the room. You're welcome. Sydney took the coffee anyway. You're insufferable. And yet here I am. She glanced at him over the rim of the cup. You always show up like this? Like what? Like a man who thinks caffeine is an apology. That got a real laugh out of him. And there it was again, that thing she had begun to notice, the way her jokes pulled him out of whatever heaviness lived behind his eyes. The way he looked lighter after talking to her, as if she had managed to drag him back toward the surface without even trying. That thought made her chest tighten in a way she did not care to examine. He sat in the chair beside her bed instead of pretending to be formal, which somehow made the room feel more intimate than if he had kissed her. Sydney hated that she noticed. So, she said carefully, are we talking about the creepy note, or are we pretending it didn't happen? We're talking about it. Excellent. I'm ready to be deeply uncomfortable. Callan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Gideon has been moving in the castle longer than I wanted to admit. Sydney frowned. How long? Long enough to learn where people stand, who owes him, and who is afraid of him. Great, she said. A social parasite with a tailored coat. Exactly. That earned another smile from him, smaller this time. Then his expression shifted. I also had the western gate searched. Sydney sat up straighter. And? And the note wasn't the only thing left behind. He reached into his pocket and set a small ribbon on the bed between them. Black silk. Sydney recognized it at once. Her face changed. Callan noticed. You know it, he said. It was mine, she said quietly. Callan's eyes narrowed. From the village? Sydney nodded once. Tessa used to wear that color when she delivered messages for the women's circle. Callan was quiet for a beat. Women's circle? Sydney gave him a look. You say that like you're shocked women in villages talk to each other. I'm shocked you had a secret organization. It was not secret. It had a ribbon code. That makes it organized, not secret. He looked like he might argue, then decided against it, and Sydney liked him a little more for that. But the black ribbon had changed the air between them. This means someone from your past is here, he said. Yes. Someone Gideon can use. Yes. He held her gaze. And someone who knows enough to hurt you. Sydney looked down at the ribbon. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. That part is not new. Callan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. It should be. That stopped her. Not because it was dramatic, because he said it like he meant it. Sydney looked at him then, really looked, and saw the strain he had been carrying under the humor. Gideon's games were one thing, but Callan was also carrying the responsibility of a whole kingdom, a pregnant mare he adored, and now an Omega who seemed determined to walk into his life and rearrange his heart without permission. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Instead, she took another sip of coffee and said, You know, for a man who looks like he was carved out of winter, you're surprisingly easy to bother. His mouth curved. And for a woman who nearly froze to death in a river, you're surprisingly bold. Only when I'm indoors. That's fair. A pause. Then Callan looked toward the window. I want to show you something. Sydney narrowed her eyes. That sounds suspicious. It should. She stared at him. That is not reassuring. Good. He stood and offered her his hand. Sydney looked at it for a long moment. Then, because she had apparently lost all common sense, she took it. His hand was warm, steady, too strong to be casual, too gentle to be threatening. He did not squeeze, did not tug. He simply waited until she chose to move with him. That mattered more than it should have. They crossed the castle in silence, broken only by the occasional footstep, and the low murmur of early servants beginning their day. Callan led her through a side hall she had not seen before, down one narrow stair, and out through a back passage into a courtyard she had somehow missed entirely. The cold air hit her first. Then the sound. Daisy. The mare stood near the center of the yard under a blanket draped over her back, tail flicking irritably while two stable hands tried very hard to look like they were not being judged. She was larger than before, clearly restless, her pregnant belly rounding under the wool. Sydney smiled despite herself. Callan had been right. He had brought her out here for a reason. She refuses to stay inside, he said. Apparently she has opinions. Sydney snorted. She's learned from the wrong people. Callan glanced at her. You mean me? I wasn't naming names. He looked far too pleased. They approached Daisy slowly. The mare lifted her head the moment she saw Sydney and huffed once, then nudged her shoulder as if demanding immediate attention. Sydney stroked her neck. You missed me? Daisy snorted again and stamped once. Callan folded his arms. That looked like a yes. She says you're not allowed to get arrogant about it. I already was. Sydney laughed before she could stop herself. That was when she heard footsteps behind them. Not servant footsteps. Measured, controlled, Gideon. Of course. He appeared at the archway to the courtyard with one hand in his coat pocket and the other holding a folded paper. He looked perfectly composed, which only made Sydney more suspicious. "I hoped I'd find you here," he said. "Shouldn't you be somewhere annoying someone else?" Sydney asked. Callan almost smiled. Gideon ignored her. "I've brought news." Callan's tone flattened. "You seem to do that too often." Gideon's eyes flicked to Daisy, then back to Sydney. "The woman from your village has requested an audience." Sydney felt the air change around her. Callan noticed immediately. "You didn't say that last night," Sydney said. Gideon's smile was faint. "I'm saying it now." "Why?" "Because," he said, "she's not here to talk to you alone." The courtyard went still. Callan stepped slightly closer to Sydney. Not enough for anyone to call it obvious. Enough for her to feel it. "Who else is with her?" he asked. Gideon looked at him. "Someone who remembers your mother." Sydney turned sharply toward Callan. That landed hard. For the first time since she'd known him, his face went completely still. And Sydney understood before he said a word that whatever was coming next was not just about her. Gideon watched that reaction with something like satisfaction. He had come prepared. Sydney hated him for that. Callan's voice was low, dangerous, controlled. "Bring her in." Gideon's smile deepened, but only for a moment. Then he nodded and left. Silence returned to the courtyard, but it was a worse kind now. Sydney looked up at Callan. "Your mother?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was quiet. "There are parts of my past I don't hand out freely." That sounded suspiciously dramatic. He gave her one tired look. "You're standing in my courtyard while my enemy brings a woman who knows things about my mother. I think dramatic is the correct word." Sydney should have been scared. Instead, she felt angry on his behalf. And something else, too. Something warm and fierce and far too personal. She touched his arm. "Then I'm not leaving." He looked at her hand, then at her face. "You say that like it's a decision." "It is." For a second, his expression shifted. Not into the king, not even into the man, but into something quieter, something grateful. It made her heart stumble. Then he said very softly, "You have no idea what that does to me." Sydney opened her mouth, closed it. Because she did know, and that was the problem. She had not come into this castle to change him. But somehow, that was exactly what she was doing. And if Gideon thought he could use the past to tear them apart, he was about to find out that some things did not break under pressure. They only burned brighter. Sydney did not like waiting. Waiting made her thoughts loud, and loud thoughts made room for fear. And fear had been her least favorite companion since childhood. So when the woman from her past was finally brought into the castle, Sydney was already standing beside Callan in the upper sitting room, arms crossed, spine straight, and every muscle in her body pretending it was calm. She was not calm. Callan noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You're doing that thing," he murmured. Sydney did not look at him. "What thing?" "The one where you act like you're about to bite someone." "I might?" "Good to know." She glanced at him, and despite everything, he looked almost amused. Not careless, never careless. But there was a spark in him now that had not been there when she first arrived. A liveliness, a readiness to meet whatever came next, instead of merely surviving it. Sydney was beginning to suspect that spark had something to do with her, which was both flattering and deeply inconvenient. The door opened. A woman stepped in with Gideon behind her. Sydney recognized her immediately. Tessa had the same careful face she always had, but today it looked tighter, as if she had not slept in days and had been told not to show it. She wore a plain dress, dark at the sleeves, and her hands were clasped together so tightly Sydney could see the strain in her knuckles. Gideon, of course, looked infuriatingly composed. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if he had personally invented hospitality. Tessa ignored him. Her eyes went straight to Sydney. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Tessa let out a shaky breath. "You look different." Sydney gave her a flat look. "That's because I'm indoors and not being humiliated in public." Callan made a short sound that might have been a cough. Gideon's mouth twitched. Tessa's expression faltered, then softened by a fraction. "You always said things like that." "Yes," Sydney said. "I'm still talented." That almost got a real smile out of Tessa. Almost. Gideon stepped forward. "Perhaps we should discuss the matter at hand." Sydney turned to him. "You mean the part where you dragged an old acquaintance into a castle to make me nervous?" Gideon looked at her with calm eyes. "I mean the part where your past has finally caught up with you." Callan's voice turned colder than the room. "Choose your words carefully." Gideon bowed his head, though it looked more like a performance than respect. "Of course, Your Majesty." Sydney hated that tone, hated that he knew exactly how to sound harmless while being anything but. Tessa finally spoke. "I didn't come to hurt you." Sydney looked at her. "Then why are you here?" Tessa swallowed. "Because there are things you should know." Callan leaned a little closer to Sydney, not enough to crowd her, just enough that she felt the warmth of him at her side. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked quietly. That almost undid her. Not the question itself. The fact that he asked it. Sydney looked at him, and in that instant, she understood something simple and devastating. He would step back if she asked, even now, even with Gideon in the room and the air ready to split open. That made her trust him more than anything else had. "No," she said. "Stay." Something eased in his face, just a little. Tessa watched the exchange, and something unreadable moved across her expression. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out a folded strip of paper. Sydney's gaze locked on it. Tessa held it out. "I found this among my things years ago. I never understood why it mattered until recently." Sydney took it carefully. It was old and worn at the edges. Inside was a small pressed flower, a blue one. Sydney's breath caught so hard it hurt. Callan noticed immediately. "What is it?" She stared at the flower like it might vanish if she looked away. "My mother used to press these in books." The room went very still. Tessa's eyes shone with something close to guilt. "Your mother gave it to me. She said if anything ever happened, I was supposed to bring it to you." Sydney looked up sharply. "What do you mean, anything?" Tessa hesitated. Gideon answered for her. "The village elders knew more about you than they ever admitted." Sydney's stomach tightened. Callan's entire body changed. He did not move, but the air around him sharpened. Tessa's voice dropped. "They sent me away before they sent you. They said you were causing trouble, that you were too defiant, too much of a mouth, too visible." Sydney laughed once, bitter and short. "That sounds like me." Tessa looked miserable. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix being discarded." "No," Tessa said. "But it explains why your mother was afraid." That hit harder than Sydney expected. She tightened her grip on the flower. Callan stepped closer now. "Afraid of what?" Tessa looked to Gideon, then away again, as if she regretted his presence the moment she had seen him in the doorway. "Of the mark," she said. Sydney frowned. "What mark?" Tessa's voice trembled. "The old one. The one your mother believed would wake if you ever met the wrong man." Silence. Callan looked at Sydney, and for the first time since she had met him, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Not fear, recognition. Sydney felt it immediately. She turned to him. "You know something." He didn't answer fast enough. That was answer enough. Gideon noticed it too, and his smile sharpened. "So it is true," he said softly. "You've started remembering." Callan's gaze snapped to him. "What are you talking about?" Gideon ignored him and looked at Sydney instead. Your mother didn't leave you that flower as comfort, Sydney. She left it as a warning. Sydney's pulse jumped hard once. No, she said. Tessa's face went pale. I didn't know that. Know what? Sydney demanded. Gideon stepped forward a little, not close enough to touch, just close enough to make the space feel smaller. That you are not the first woman in your line to attract the wrong kind of fate. Callan moved then. Fast. He stepped between them, not touching Sydney but shielding her anyway. The gesture hit her so suddenly she nearly forgot how to breathe. Enough, he said. Gideon held up his hands, almost innocent. I'm only telling the truth. No, Callan said. You're enjoying this. Gideon smiled. Aren't you? The silence after that was dangerous. Sydney looked up at Callan's profile, rigid and controlled, and realized something had shifted. The king was no longer only protecting her from Gideon. He was protecting himself from whatever this truth might mean. That terrified her more than Gideon's smug face. Tessa looked between them, then whispered, I shouldn't have come. Why did you? Sydney asked. Tessa's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Because your mother asked me to keep watch. And because I thought if I waited long enough, maybe I could tell you before someone else used it against you. Sydney's throat tightened. She hated that sentence. Hated that it was kind. Hated even more that it came from someone who had once been too weak to stand beside her. Callan turned slightly toward Sydney, his voice lower now. What is the mark? Sydney shook her head. I don't know. But she did know one thing. Her body had already begun to react. A faint heat under her skin. A prickling at the back of her neck. The same strange awareness she had felt near Callan since the riverbank. Only stronger now. Sharper. Almost alive. She swallowed hard. Callan saw the change in her face at once. Sydney! Before she could answer, the flower in her hand gave off a brief, sharp glow. Everyone froze. The room went silent in a way Sydney had never heard before. The blue petals trembled once, then a thread of pale light slipped from them and touched her wrist like a living thing. Sydney gasped and jerked back. The mark burned. Not painfully. Not exactly. But with a heat so sudden and intimate, it felt like something waking up beneath her skin. Callan grabbed her wrist instinctively. The moment his hand closed around hers, the light flared. Gideon took one step back, his face shifting for the first time into something less controlled. Tessa covered her mouth, and Sydney, staring at the pale glow now faintly circling her skin, felt Callan go completely still. His voice came out rough. Sydney! She looked up at him. He was watching her like he had just seen a future he had not expected. And then she saw it. Not in words. In the raw, stunned certainty in his face. He knew what the mark meant. And whatever it was, it had just chosen her. The mark did not disappear. By the time Sydney was finally back in her room, the pale light had faded from her wrist, but the warmth stayed behind like a second pulse. She stood near the window with her sleeves pushed up, staring at the faint shape that still shimmered just under her skin. Callan had insisted on walking her there himself. He had also insisted on pretending he was calm. He was terrible at it. You're doing that thing again, Sydney said without looking at him. Callan stood by the door with his arms folded. What thing? The one where you look like you want to arrest the universe. I might. That finally pulled a short laugh out of her, though her nerves were still crawling. She hated how fast the castle had gone from warm to dangerous. She hated even more that Callan had followed her every step like a promise. He had not left once. Not after the mark. Not after the light. Not after Gideon had gone unnaturally quiet. Which was somehow worse than if he had argued. Sydney turned from the window. You know what it is. Callan did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. He looked tired now, but not weak. Never weak. More like a man carrying the weight of several things he had not chosen and one thing he very much had. At last he said, "It's older than the kingdom." Sydney crossed her arms. "That's a very kingly sentence." "That's because it's a very kingly problem." She narrowed her eyes. "You're avoiding the part where you tell me what it does." Callan's mouth twitched. "I'm considering whether you'll hate me if I do." She stared at him. Then, very carefully, "That depends." His gaze held hers. "On what?" "On whether you keep acting like a man with secrets or start acting like one with manners." That got a real smile from him, but only for a second. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Sydney's pulse kicked once, not because he had come closer, because he had chosen privacy. That made this feel real. He leaned back against the door, not touching her, giving her space even now. She noticed that more than she wanted to. "The mark," he said, "is tied to the old bond line." Sydney frowned. "The what?" "It was once believed that certain women in your bloodline could be chosen by a mate bond strong enough to affect both body and fate." "Chosen." He watched her face carefully. "Not forced. Chosen." She let out a breath. "That is not helping." "No, probably not." "Callan." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "When the mark wakes, it means the bond is active." Sydney went still. "Bond," she repeated. "Yes?" "With who?" He didn't answer. Her stomach dropped. "Callan." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression gave the truth away before he said a word. The room seemed to tilt. "No," Sydney said softly. His voice was low. "Sydney, no." She took a step back. "No, absolutely not. You do not get to stand there looking all grim and noble and tell me that some ancient magic decided to set me up with a king who already thinks he can order the weather." Callan blinked once. Then, to her complete disbelief, he laughed. Not loudly. Not because it was funny. Because she was. That made her even more offended. "You're enjoying this?" she demanded. "I'm not enjoying the part where you're terrified." "Good." "I am, however," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting again. "A little impressed that your first reaction to an ancient soul bond is to insult my authority." Sydney pointed at him. "That's not my first reaction." "What was your first reaction?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Because honestly, panic had arrived first, then shock. Then, underneath both of those, something far more dangerous. The same strange pull she had been fighting since the river. She hated that he knew it. He saw the answer in her silence. His face changed, only a little. But enough. The humor faded. Something heavy and careful took its place. Sydney looked away first this time. "That cannot be real," she said. "It is." She turned back to him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want to frighten you." She laughed once sharply. "That ship sailed." Callan pushed off the door and crossed the room slowly, not in a way meant to corner her, in a way meant to keep from startling her. Sydney stayed where she was, every muscle tense, every nerve loud. "When the mark surfaced," he said quietly, "I knew what it was. And you just..." "What?" "Decided to let me figure it out while everybody stared at me like I'd grown a second head? I was trying to protect you." "From what?" He stopped a few feet away. "From Gideon." That name made the air turn sharp again. Sydney's hands curled at her sides. "He knew." "Yes." "How?" "Because he's been hunting the bond for years." That hit like a slap. Sydney stared. "Why?" Callan's jaw tightened. "Because if he can control the woman marked by it, he can control the line itself." Silence. Then Sydney said, "That is the ugliest sentence anyone has ever said to me." Callan's expression softened in a way she had not expected. It was not meant to be ugly. It should have been. Before he could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Both of them froze. Callan's head lifted. "What is it?" A guard's voice came through the wood, tight with urgency. "Your Majesty, the Mare is ill." Sydney's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, ill?" she demanded. "She won't stand," the guard said. "And she's sweating." Callan was already moving. Sydney was right beside him before he reached the door. "You said she was just restless." "I said she was worried." "She is a pregnant horse, Callan. That is not a diagnosis." He shot her a look that would have been offended if it weren't also worried. "Do you have a better one?" "Yes, panic." "Mine." He almost smiled, which was absurd, because they were both already halfway to the corridor. They reached Daisy's stall fast. Too fast. The Mare was standing, but barely. Her legs looked tense under her, her breathing shallow, her ears twitching toward every sound. A sheen of sweat glistened along her neck. Sydney's heart dropped. "Daisy." The Mare turned her head toward her, then gave a low, unsettled sound. Callan moved immediately to her side. "What happened?" A stable hand looked miserable. "She was fine an hour ago. Then she started pacing. She refused water. Then she just went stiff." Sydney was already touching Daisy's shoulder, speaking softly to her, fingers searching for signs of injury. Then she felt it. Not pain. Fear. Deep, sharp, unmistakable fear. Sydney looked up. Something scared her. Callan's face darkened. Gideon. Neither of them said it, but they both thought it. The stable hand shifted awkwardly. "There's more." Of course there was. Sydney turned. "What now?" He swallowed. "We found this under the straw." He held out a small scrap of black ribbon. Sydney's entire body went rigid. Callan took it first. He stared at it for 1 second, then looked at Sydney. No words. None needed. Gideon had been here. Or someone working for him had. Sydney's pulse hammered hard enough to make her dizzy. He was in her stall? "Not alone," Callan said quietly. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" His gaze sharpened. "It means he wanted us to find it." Sydney stared at the ribbon in his hand. "Why?" Callan looked toward Daisy, then back at her. "Because he wants us distracted." And just as he said it, the Mare let out a sharp, panicked sound that sent every guard in the corridor stepping back. Sydney moved instantly, pressing her palm to Daisy's neck, speaking in a low, steady voice. Hey, you're okay. I've got you." The Mare trembled. Then, very slowly, settled. Callan watched Sydney with something raw in his face. Not surprise, not anymore. Recognition. She was the calm in the room. The thing that settled what was frightened. The thing that made the castle breathe differently. And he looked at her like he was seeing it clearly for the first time. Sydney swallowed hard. She didn't want the feeling in her chest right then. It was too soft. Too vulnerable. Too much like hope. "Callan," she said quietly, "he's escalating. Yes, he wants the bond, the Mare, me, all of it. Yes." She looked at him. "And what do you want?" The question landed. Heavy, honest, dangerous. Callan was silent for only a second, but it felt longer. Then he said, "You." Sydney forgot how to breathe. Not because it was dramatic. Because he said it like a man stating the simplest truth in the world. Not the bond, not the politics, not the danger. You. His gaze held hers, unwavering. The stall had gone very quiet. Even Daisy seemed to sense it, because the Mare nudged Sydney's shoulder once, as if impatient with all the tension. Sydney let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That is an extremely reckless answer." Callan's mouth curved, small and tired and real. "I'm aware." She should have looked away. She didn't. Somewhere in the castle, Gideon was moving pieces. Somewhere outside, the river still ran cold beneath the hills. And here, in the warm stall with a frightened mare and a king who had finally stopped pretending, Sydney realized the worst part. She wanted to be chosen by him. Not because of the mark, because of the man. By midnight, the castle had gone too quiet. That was how Sydney knew something was wrong. Not because the halls were empty. Not because the servants had all vanished into their routines, but because the air itself felt watched, as if the stone walls had leaned in to listen. Even Daisy had settled into an uneasy stillness, her ears flicking at every distant sound. Sydney stood at the window with her arms folded, staring out at the dark ridge beyond the courtyard. Callan had not come back. That fact annoyed her more than it worried her, which was a lie her body did not seem interested in accepting. "You're doing that thing again." She turned. Gideon was standing in the doorway as if he had every right to be there, hands behind his back, expression smooth enough to make a saint suspicious. Sydney's face went flat. "If you're here to annoy me, congratulations, mission accomplished." He smiled faintly. "You wound me. You're standing there. I think you'll survive." Gideon stepped inside, closing the door behind him with measured care. That made the room feel smaller immediately. Sydney hated that he knew how to do that. "I came to warn you," he said. "Of course you did. This time I'm being sincere." Sydney laughed once, sharp and humorless. That's what makes it alarming. His eyes flicked to her wrist. The faint mark was still there, pale under the skin. Not glowing now, but never fully gone. Watching, waiting. Gideon noticed her glance. "So it is true," he said softly. "The bond has awakened." Sydney's jaw tightened. "You say that like you're happy about it." "I'm interested." "That's worse." He took a slow step toward her. "Do you know what happens when a bond like that forms?" "I'm sure you're about to tell me." He did not look offended. That almost made him more dangerous. "It makes the marked woman a key." Sydney stared at him. "A key to what?" Gideon's smile was thin now. "To loyalty, to power, to a king who will do almost anything to keep her." Her stomach turned, not because she didn't understand, because she did. He watched her reaction with obvious satisfaction, then continued. "And if the wrong person controls the key, the kingdom opens exactly the way they want." Sydney crossed her arms tighter. "You love hearing yourself talk, don't you?" "Only when I'm right." "That must be exhausting." "Less exhausting than pretending you don't want the truth." Sydney's chin lifted. "I want the truth. I just don't want yours." That finally made something hard flash through his expression. Gideon reached into his coat and removed a folded parchment. "Then perhaps this version will interest you." Sydney did not move. He held it out anyway. She took it carefully, suspicious from the first touch. The seal on the back was old, cracked with age. Not the castles, not the villages. Something older. Sydney unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the first line, then stopped. Her breath caught, because it was written in her mother's hand. Not a copy, not a rumor. Her mother's actual handwriting. Her fingers tightened so hard the paper creased. Gideon watched her face with clinical patience. "You recognize it." Sydney could barely speak. "Where did you get this?" "From a drawer your village leaders thought no one would ever search." She looked up sharply. He nodded once. "Your mother left instructions." "For what?" His voice lowered. "For the night the bond woke." The room seemed to tilt. Sydney's mouth went dry. "What does it say?" Gideon's smile thinned. "That the one marked by the old line would either save the kingdom or burn it clean." For a second, there was only silence. Then Sydney crushed the parchment in her fist. "No." Gideon did not flinch. "It is not an insult. It is a warning." It's a threat dressed up as prophecy. It can be both. Sydney's pulse hammered. The anger felt clean and useful, better than fear, better than the icy pressure in her chest. You brought me my mother's handwriting just to watch me panic? No. His gaze sharpened. I brought it because Callan would never tell you what it means. The mention of the king made her look toward the door. Still empty. Still too long. Where is he? She asked. Gideon's silence was answer enough. Sydney stepped forward. Where is Callan? Outside the northern walls, Gideon said, following a trail. Of what? His gaze slid away, almost pleased. Of me. Her heart dropped. Before she could move, a heavy knock struck the outer door, then another. Sydney turned just as the lock rattled. A guard's voice came through, tense and breathless. My lady! The door flew open. Callan strode in with snow on his shoulders and fury in his eyes. He looked alive, but only just. His coat was torn at one sleeve. There was a cut at his jaw. Not severe. Enough. Sydney crossed the room before she could stop herself. What happened? His eyes found hers first. Not Gideon. Not the letter. Her. That alone made her chest tighten. Trick, he said. Gideon's smile returned. You're welcome. Callan's head snapped toward him. You led me out there. Yes. Sydney looked between them. One of you is going to explain this before I start throwing things. Callan gave Gideon one cold glance, then answered her. He planted a false trail. I followed it. And someone waited. His voice had changed. Sydney heard it instantly. Not panic. Worse. Control stretched too thin. Who? She asked. Callan's jaw flexed once. No one you need to worry about. She stared at him. That is the worst answer you could possibly give me. Gideon's expression sharpened. She already knows, doesn't she? Callan said nothing. Sydney felt the room go still around that silence. No, she said quietly. No, I don't like that look. I really don't like that look. Callan moved toward her. Sydney. She backed up a step. Tell me. His face changed just slightly. That was enough. Her blood went cold. Because she understood. They went after Daisy. Callan closed his eyes for one brief second, which told her everything. Sydney turned on Gideon so fast the breath left her lungs. You did this. His expression did not change. I did what was necessary. You touched her? I touched nothing. Then what did you do? I made sure the king's attention was elsewhere. Sydney's hands shook with fury. You used the mare. Gideon's voice cooled. I used an opportunity. Callan stepped forward then, and the room changed with him. Not louder, not flashier. Just darker. If she is harmed, he said, you will regret existing. Sydney had never heard him sound like that before. Not angry, certain. Gideon looked at him, unbothered in the way only the truly dangerous can be. You're too late for that. The silence that followed was so sharp, it felt physical. Then Sydney was moving. She strode past both men, out the door, down the corridor at a pace that would have qualified as a threat if anger were an athletic event. Callan caught up to her fast. Where are you going? To see if she's alive. She is. Sydney stopped so suddenly he nearly ran into her. She turned. You don't know that. His face tightened. I do. You do not get to say that and expect me to relax. Callan looked like he was fighting the urge to grab her. Not out of control, but out of fear. Which somehow made the next part worse. She's alive, he said, quieter now. They didn't touch her. They wanted me gone, not her dead. Sydney held his gaze. Then, in a voice gone flat with panic she refused to name, asked, Then why are you bleeding? The question landed. Callan didn't answer fast enough. Sydney's anger shifted, not vanished, shifted. He looked away once, just a fraction. And there it was. Someone had gotten close enough to hurt him. Gideon watched the exchange from the doorway with visible interest, as if this all confirmed some private theory he'd been waiting to test. Sydney hated him almost as much as she hated how much she cared that Callan was hurt. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Show me." His eyes lifted to hers. "Sydney, show me." He held her gaze for one long second. Then he turned his head enough for her to see the fresh slash beneath his collar, shallow but angry and still bleeding through the fabric. Sydney's throat tightened, not because it was serious, because someone had gotten close enough to make him bleed, and because he had still come back to her first. That mattered too much. She looked at the wound, then at him, and without thinking reached up and pressed her fingers to the edge of the torn cloth. Careful, almost tender. Callan went still. The air between them changed. Not enough for anyone to call it anything. Enough for both of them to feel it. Her hand lingered a second too long. His gaze dropped to her mouth. Sydney felt her own breathing shift. And then, from down the corridor, came the sharp sound of frantic footsteps. A guard skidded to a stop in the doorway. "Your Majesty, Daisy is down." Everything in the room stopped. Callan's face drained. Sydney's heart lurched. Gideon smiled, not openly, just enough. And Sydney, seeing that, understood the one thing she had not wanted to understand. This had not been a distraction. It was the trap. Sydney was running before the guard finished speaking. The castle blurred around her, all stone and torchlight and too many doors, while one terrible thought beat in time with her footsteps. Not Daisy? Not Daisy. Not Daisy. Callan caught up half a corridor later. "Wait!" She did not. "Move." His hand closed around her wrist, not hard, just enough to stop her. "Sydney." She turned on him so fast the air between them snapped. "If you tell me to calm down, I will actually bite you." His mouth twitched once, but the worry in his face did not budge. "I wasn't going to say calm down." "What were you going to say?" "That you're shaking." She looked down. Annoyingly, she was. That only made her angrier. "Then stop staring and help me." He released her wrist immediately. That small act hit harder than it should have. He had every right to hold on, every reason to lead, and instead he let her go because she needed it. That was Callan, always reading her better than she wanted. They reached the lower stall at a run. Daisy was standing, but barely. Her sides heaved, her ears pinned back, and her huge, pregnant body trembled with a strain that made Sydney's stomach clench. The mare was alive, thank God, but only just holding herself together. Sydney crossed the stall in 2 steps and pressed a hand to Daisy's neck. The mare leaned into her immediately. "Oh, sweetheart," Sydney whispered. Callan looked from the mare to Sydney, then to the broken latch hanging from the door. Gideon had been here. Of course he had. Sydney saw it in Callan's face before he said a word. The king's jaw was locked so hard it looked painful. "Tell me what happened," he said to the stable hand. The man swallowed. "We found the floor disturbed. Fresh straw over a patch of spilled grain. Then she went down hard and wouldn't rise. She's been scared ever since." Sydney's fingers moved over Daisy's shoulder and down her flank, checking carefully. No blood, no obvious wound, but the fear was there, deep and raw, and fear in a pregnant animal could turn dangerous fast. "She was frightened on purpose," Sydney said. Callan's eyes darkened. "I know." That was all. No speech, no explanation, just certainty. Sydney looked up at him. "You knew this was coming?" "I knew he would try something." "That is not the same thing." "No," Callan said, voice low. "It isn't." The words were barely out when another sound cut through the stall. A weak, hoarse nicker. Sydney froze. Daisy staggered. Callan was there at once, one hand on the mare's shoulder, the other braced near the wall. Easy. Sydney searched the mare's face, then the floor, then the stall behind her. Nothing seemed broken. But something was wrong, and the wrongness was spreading. The mare's breathing had gone shallow. "Move," Sydney said. Callan stepped back instantly. She knelt, hands steady now because panic had already burned itself out into focus. "Daisy, look at me." The mare did. Sydney spoke softly, trying to slow her breathing, trying to calm the tension in her body. She had handled frightened animals before, hurt ones too. But this was different. This animal mattered to someone who mattered to her, and that made every second feel sharpened. Callan watched her work like he was memorizing every move. Then the mare's ears snapped forward. Not toward Sydney, toward the doorway. Both of them turned. Gideon was standing there. He looked perfectly composed, which meant he had absolutely caused this. Sydney rose so fast the stool behind her scraped hard against the floor. "You," she said. Gideon raised his brows slightly. "That sounds ungrateful." Callan moved in front of Sydney before she could reach him. "What did you do?" Gideon's mouth curved. "I would never harm a royal animal." "That's not an answer." "It is if you're listening carefully." Sydney glared at him over Callan's shoulder. "You touched her stall." "I visited." "You terrified her." He gave a faint shrug. "Perhaps she is sensitive." Callan's voice went deadly quiet. "You came here to provoke me." Gideon looked almost amused. "No, I came here to remind you that the bond is waking at exactly the wrong time." Silence fell hard. Sydney looked between them. "What does that mean?" Neither man answered immediately. That was answer enough. Her skin prickled. "Callan." He exhaled once. "There are people who would use the bond to control the throne." Sydney stared at him. "You should have led with that." Gideon smiled. "He should have led with a great many things." Sydney turned on Gideon. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time his expression slipped just enough to show something real underneath. "I told you once," he said quietly. "I noticed you." That is not an explanation. It's the only honest one. Sydney almost laughed at how absurd that sounded. Almost. Instead, she stepped around Callan, refusing to let either man turn her into a bystander in her own life. "You've been circling me for weeks, buying flowers, sending messages, dragging my past into this castle like a threat wrapped in perfume." "Why?" Gideon's eyes stayed on her. "Because I thought if anyone understood being overlooked, it would be you." That stopped her. Not because it was kind, because it wasn't. It was almost worse. "Don't pretend you know me," she said. "I know enough." "No, you know enough to be dangerous." That made something sharp flash through his face. "And you don't think the king is dangerous?" Callan went very still. Sydney felt him beside her before she looked. Gideon had crossed a line. Sydney should have answered carefully. She didn't. "No," she said. "He's honest about it." The silence that followed was brutal. Callan's breath changed beside her. Not anger. Something deeper, and maybe more vulnerable. Gideon saw it too. Of course he did. He smiled. "You defend him well," he said. Sydney lifted her chin. "He doesn't need me to defend him." "Then why are you doing it?" Before she could answer, Daisy gave another strained sound and swayed. Callan turned immediately, all attention snapping back to the mare. The shift in him was instant and absolute. Whatever had been happening between the three of them vanished in the face of the animal's distress. Sydney moved with him. Together they steadied Daisy, one on each side, their hands overlapping only once before they both noticed. Neither pulled away fast enough. The contact was brief. It should have meant nothing. It did not. Callan's hand was warm over hers, his fingers steady against the mare's side. Sydney's breath caught, and she hated herself for noticing the exact strength of his touch. The exact way his thumb had brushed her knuckles before he shifted. The mare settled by inches. Gideon watched them from the doorway like a man watching a door he wanted shut, but had already learned how to open. Sydney saw the look and understood all at once that he was not just angry. He was jealous, not of a kiss, of trust. That realization made her stomach turn. Callan finally looked at Gideon. "Get out!" Gideon did not move. "Now," Callan said. Something in the king's voice made two guards at the corridor entrance glance toward the stall. Sydney expected Gideon to push, to grin, to say one more poisonous thing. Instead, he looked at her. Only her. And said softly, "The worst part is, you believe he sees you clearly." Sydney's skin chilled. Gideon left before Callan could stop him. The moment the door shut, the stall felt larger and emptier. Daisy was trembling less now, but the fear remained in her eyes. Sydney stayed beside her, one hand on her neck, breathing slowly. Callan stood close enough that she could feel him, not touching, almost worse. "Sydney," he said. She looked at him. The anger was still there, but now it was tangled with something else. Concern, frustration, relief that she was still standing. "He wanted this reaction," Callan said. "I know. He wanted me angry. I know that too." His gaze held hers. "And he wanted you rattled." She let out a breath, short and bitter. "Congratulations to him." Callan almost smiled, but it didn't last. "You shouldn't have had to hear any of that." "Which part?" "The part where he tried to make you doubt me." Sydney looked at Daisy, then back at him. "That part didn't work." His eyes searched hers. "Didn't it?" For a second, she was silent, because the truth was complicated. Gideon had not made her doubt Callan. He had made her realize exactly how much she was already choosing him. And that was terrifying. Sydney swallowed hard and glanced away. "You know, I was perfectly happy being emotionally mysterious." Callan's mouth curved despite everything. "That's a lie." "It's not. You're extremely easy to read when you're irritated. I hate that." "I know." That small, almost lazy response, so full of quiet affection, nearly undid her. She looked at him again. He was still standing there as if the world had not spent the last hour trying to claw its way between them. The stall was warm. Daisy was calmer. The danger had not passed, but for one moment the room held the strange, fragile shape of safety. Sydney hated how much she wanted to lean into it. Instead, she asked, "What happens now?" Callan's eyes sharpened. "Now," he said, "we stop letting Gideon choose the pace." Sydney blinked. "That sounds suspiciously like a plan." "It is." "Good." He reached for the stall door, then paused. "And Sydney?" She looked up. His voice had gone low, careful. "You were right earlier." "About which part?" His gaze held hers. "The part where you said, 'I see you clearly.'" Her throat tightened, because he had not said you like a prize, or you like a duty, or you like the bond. He had said it like a truth. And when he left the stall, Sydney stayed there beside Daisy, staring after him with her heart doing something wildly unhelpful. For the first time, she understood exactly what Gideon feared. Not the bond, not the mark. The fact that Callan had chosen her before either of them knew what that choice would cost. By the time dawn broke over the northern ridge, the castle no longer felt like a place holding its breath. It felt alive. Sydney stood at the long window in Callan's private chamber, her hand resting over the faint mark at her wrist, and watched the first light spill across the hills where the river curved below the frost line. Somewhere in the western wing, Daisy was finally calm again. Somewhere beyond the walls, Gideon Ashford was no longer moving pieces. And somewhere inside these stone corridors, a king who had once carried his grief like armor was now walking toward a future he had chosen with his whole heart. Callan entered quietly, but she knew it was him before she turned. He had been with the council most of the night. The tiredness in his face said so, but it was a better tiredness now. The kind that comes after truth, after decisions made cleanly, after a man stops pretending the weight is meant for him alone. "You're awake," he said. Sydney glanced at him. "You say that like I had a peaceful sleep." His mouth curved. "You slept for 2 hours." "Exactly. Traumatic." He came to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. It still sent that impossible little spark through her body, the one she had stopped trying to analyze because it was becoming the background of her life. Outside, the castle bells rang once. Not alarm. Ceremony. Sydney's pulse quickened. "What's happening?" Callan looked out over the courtyard. "The council has agreed." She turned fully toward him. "Agreed to what?" He met her eyes, and the steady certainty there made her breath catch. "To end the old blood claim," he said. "To dissolve the law that let people like Gideon hide behind custom. To name the bond for what it is, not what they feared it could be." Sydney stared at him. "You did that in one night?" He gave a very tired, very dry look. "I did not do it alone." That was when she understood. He meant her. The mark. The truth. The fact that she had stepped into his life and refused to be used by it. Her throat tightened before she could stop it. "You fought for that," she said quietly. Callan's expression shifted, softer now. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was lower than the morning. "Because I was done letting the past decide who gets to belong here." The words settled into her chest with a weight that felt almost sacred. Below them, the courtyard began to fill. Servants moved first, then guards, then members of the council, and finally the few people who had learned to gather when something important was about to change. Sydney could hear the murmur of voices rising through the stone, a sound full of expectation instead of fear. Callan offered her his hand. She looked at it, then at him. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Making me trust you before I've fully decided to." His mouth curved. And it's annoying." "But?" Sydney took his hand. "But it's working." That earned her the faintest smile. He led her down through the halls and into the courtyard, where the cold air bit at her cheeks and the entire castle seemed to be waiting. Daisy stood near the steps with a silver cloth draped over her back, calmer now, but still heavy with life. Sydney's eyes softened instantly. The mare lifted her head at the sight of her. "You were worried," Sydney murmured. Daisy snorted softly, as if offended by the understatement. Callan glanced at the mare, then at Sydney. "She's been inspecting everyone like a royal judge." "Good. Someone should." A few people laughed at that, the sound spreading lightly through the courtyard. It was strange, still, how much easier laughter came here now, as if the castle had been waiting a long time for permission. Then Gideon was brought out. Sydney's spine stiffened at once. He looked worse than before, not broken, never broken, but stripped of the polished confidence he wore like a second skin. There was no smile this time, no easy charm. Just a man who had finally run out of ways to make himself look larger than he was. He stopped when he saw Sydney, and for one brief second, something almost human flickered in his face. Almost. Sydney met his eyes without flinching. He had wanted to own her, shape her, use her fear to tighten every thread around her life. Instead, he had forced her into clarity, into herself, into Callan's arms, whether he meant to or not. That was the cruel joke of it. He had lost her the moment he tried to control her. Callan stood at her side, Not between them this time. Beside her. Equal. "Gideon Ashford," the king said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "you have used your place in this court to manipulate, threaten, and deceive." Gideon gave a thin smile. "You speak as if I'm the only man in history who has wanted something." The crowd stirred. Callan did not blink. "Wanting is not the crime." Gideon's eyes slid to Sydney. "No, refusing is." That did it. A murmur rippled through the courtyard, but Callan's answer was immediate. "No," he said. "The crime is believing anyone belongs to you." Silence. Sydney felt the words hit every corner of the square. Gideon's jaw tightened. Callan turned slightly, just enough to face the gathered court as much as the man before him. "By order of the crown, Gideon Ashford is stripped of title, authority, and access to the inner court. He will leave these lands by sunset." A shock of sound moved through the crowd. Sydney's heart pounded. Gideon looked at Callan with something cold and sharp finally breaking through his composure. "You'd exile me for her?" Callan's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "No," he said. "I'd exile you for what you tried to make her believe about herself." That was worse. Even Gideon seemed to feel it. His eyes moved back to Sydney, and for the first time there was nothing polished left in them at all, only defeat. And beneath it, the ugly knowledge that he had never loved her. He had only loved the power of being denied and still pursuing. Sydney felt no triumph, only relief. He was escorted away. When the courtyard quieted again, Callan turned to the people gathered there and lifted one hand. "This court will no longer live under fear dressed as tradition," he said. "The old blood claim is ended. No one will be forced, marked, or bartered under it again." A real wave moved through the crowd now, not applause, something deeper. "Release." Sydney stood very still, staring at him. This was the man she had found at the cliffside, the one who had raced for a falling mare, carried her into his castle, and then kept choosing tenderness over power when no one would have blamed him for choosing control. He was not just a king now. He was a home. And because her heart apparently had no sense of self-preservation left, she realized she wanted to belong to him with terrifying certainty. The crowd began to thin, but not before several servants and guards bowed toward Sydney with a respect that still felt new enough to ache. One older woman even dabbed at her eyes and muttered something about, "Finally some sense in this place," which made Sydney laugh despite herself. Callan noticed. Of course he did. When they were alone again, he turned to her. "You're smiling." "I'm allowed to." "I know. I'm just enjoying the evidence." Sydney folded her arms. "You make it hard not to." His expression softened. Then he glanced toward the western wing where Daisy had been led back to her stall. "She's due soon," he said quietly. Sydney nodded. "I know." Callan looked at her for a long time, and this time the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of everything they had survived, everything they had not said, everything they had only just started to understand. Then he reached for her hand again. This time Sydney did not hesitate. "Stay with me," he said. It was not a command, not now. It was a question handed over with his whole heart. Sydney looked at him, at the man who had lost his mother too early and spent years trying to live like grief was the only loyal thing left in the world. At the king who had laughed again because of her. At the soul who had seen her and never once treated her like an inconvenience. Then she smiled, small and certain. Always. Something in his face broke open then. Not pain, not fear, but relief so deep it almost looked like reverence. He kissed her. Not hurried. Not hungry. Not like possession, like a rival, like a promise finally spoken aloud after waiting too long. Sydney's hand came up to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath his shirt, and for one breathless moment, the whole world narrowed to the warmth of his mouth, the gentleness of his hands, the certainty of being chosen. When they parted, Callan rested his forehead against hers. "You changed my life," he said quietly. Sydney laughed softly, eyes burning. "You say that like it's surprising." "It is." "Callan." He looked at her. She smiled through the ache in her throat. "You gave me a place to come home to." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the sound came, a sharp, startled nicker from the western wing. "Daisy!" Both of them broke apart at once and ran. The stall was already filling with people by the time they arrived, though the stable hands made room immediately. Daisy was restless, pacing, her breathing quick and heavy. Sydney moved to her side at once, stroking her neck, speaking softly. Callan stood near the door, one hand braced on the frame, watching with attention he could not quite hide. The first contraction hit. Daisy shuddered. Sydney turned at once. Now. The next hour became movement, breath, heat, and quiet commands. Callan stayed with her every second, handing over cloths, water, blankets, anything she needed without asking twice. He was not the king now, not even the man. He was simply there, steady as stone, looking at Sydney like she was the only calm thing in the room. And when the first foal finally came into the world, slick and trembling and alive, the whole stall seemed to hold its breath. Then the baby cried. Daisy lowered her head, exhausted and radiant, and Sydney let out a shaky laugh that sounded a little like sobbing. Callan stared, then smiled like he had just been given back the one thing he thought he might lose forever. "A filly," Sydney said, blinking hard. Callan exhaled a rough laugh. "Of course she is." The foal stumbled clumsily against Daisy's side, and the mare nudged her with tender patience. Sydney looked up at Callan. His eyes were bright, his face open in a way she had never seen before she came into his life. And suddenly she understood with perfect clarity why she had been brought here. Not only to save the mare, not only to break the bond, not only to survive the men who had tried to use her. She had come to return joy to a king who had forgotten it was allowed. Callan reached for her hand again, and this time their fingers locked naturally, as if they had always belonged there. Outside, dawn sharpened into morning. Inside, the castle that had once felt like grief and stone now held the sound of a newborn foal, a laughing king, and a woman who had finally found where she was meant to stand. And this time, no one would ever make her leave. Epilogue. Months later, the castle was softer, not weaker, softer. Flowers grew in the courtyard where nothing had bloomed before. Servants laughed openly. Guards smiled when Sydney passed. Daisy, now proud mother to a lively young filly, liked to wander the western grounds with her daughter trotting after her like she owned the world. Sydney watched them from the terrace with Callan at her side, one hand resting over the curved swell of her own belly. He looked down at her, then at the child growing beneath her palm, and smiled like a man who had finally come home. "Still think this place felt like a prison?" he asked. Sydney leaned into him. "Not anymore." Below them, the little filly gave a stubborn kick and nearly tripped over her own feet. Callan laughed. Sydney looked up at him, then toward the horizon, and felt the quiet truth settle into her bones. She had been rejected once. Never again.